All right, hello, students. It's been a while. I know that this is a little bit later than you probably expected. I've had some technical difficulties getting my computer sorted, um, and dealing with the news coming in regarding the status of the outbreak. So hopefully we'll be on track better in the future. One of the downsides of recording these lectures, if you can't tell by the hair being wet, is that I can see exactly what I look like. Um, I sit down to record a lecture and I see that hair is out of place. And it's like, God, gotta run off and fix that. And that's, I think I prefer the blissful ignorance of just looking like a bit of a doofus in front of class. And the same is also true of these lectures, right? Like I can record a lecture, but then I have to think about it. It's kind of committed to film, and that's if maybe I have a boring lecture or an off lecture in person, well, I gave the lecture, it's done. That's not the case here. This is there's a level of commitment to these that just isn't really found in the normal lectures. Not that I try and do a bad job. It's just the the pressure is. I wouldn't say there's more pressure this way, but the pressure is definitely different. Now that said, um, I am curious if you would prefer, all of you collectively, that is, if you would prefer that we do this via Conferzoom instead. That would definitely mean that these are going to be, more regular. But the downsides for me are that the computer that can actually get hooked up to the better recording equipment, the camera and the mic, it has a terrible internet connection, and because of COVID-19, I can't exactly call someone out to do the routing and get this thing connected directly via cable. So it might be that might be an invitation to disaster, shifting to a live streamed event, and I assume this is more convenient for most of you. If that isn't the case, please let me know. I'm trying to be as flexible as possible during all of this. Um, but yeah, so we should probably get a move on. So last lecture I left off right before we talked about who exactly was a progressive, and I want to finish that discussion before we hop into the new lecture slides. Um, and you can actually find that as always, the lecture slides are available on Canvas. You're looking for California Progressives Part 2, and as the lecture progresses, keep along with what I'm telling you to look at if you could. The same is true. There's a term list, there's a list of concepts, and we'll talk about those concepts just as soon as we finish a little bit of catch up from the last lecture. I didn't want to go too far over an hour. Hopefully this is, in the range of like 45 minutes. I don't want to subject you to more lecture hours than you would get in a classroom. I don't know if that's the best route for success. So let's just try and power through this. So one of the most influential works regarding the California progressives for a long time was a scholar named, was it George Mowry or Edward Mowry? Mowry's California Progressives. What was his first name again? Yeah, it was George Mowry. It's always George, just like Pullman. So was George Mowry's work the California Progressive? It was defining in a lot of ways because he basically took them, I think it was like the 30 most prominent California progressives, and he did a mass biography of them to try and distill who they really were. Like on average, who was a California progressive. Um, and this work was, it stood for quite a long time. It was published in the 60s. And he came to the following conclusions. And I'm going to go through a list here. I hope you don't mind. But he found that generally speaking, the archetype of a California progressive was likely a man, generally Republican, typically of the professional class. So we're talking, we're not talking working class or upper class, but generally, um, generally a lawyer, a journalist, an editor, doctors. So not the upper crust of society. Still, definitely, they work for a living, but white collar jobs. Um, Typically, they worked in the city as opposed to the countryside. The suburbs hadn't developed yet. Oftentimes, they were profoundly Protestant, and that influences what we're going to talk about a little bit later when it comes to their sense of moral reform. More often than not, they were heavily involved in community and fraternal organizations, a lot of secret societies of the day that catered exclusively to men. Um, and generally speaking, they also had kind of a noblesse oblige, or how should I put this? Kind of a paternalistic attitude towards the working class, especially labor. Um, so, in one sense, they wanted the best for them. They wanted to improve their lives, but that was tinged with a bit of, I don't want to say contempt, but I know better than you attitude. Now, these are all generalizations, and they've come under some scrutiny in recent years. In particular, two of his assertions, well, really three of his assertions, are under scrutiny make less sense. The first, um, the first claimed that they were generally men, the progressives were generally male. When it comes to the politicians, the actual people elected to office, that is certainly true. However, if you take a step back and you look at who exactly was doing the groundwork, I don't know if any of you are familiar with the kind of community organizing that goes behind politics today, what goes into the sausage. But what's critically important, it's not the stump speeches, but it's the organizing, it's the knocking on doors, it's the making contacts, getting donors, that sort of thing. And all of that critical work, if we just take a step back and look at like the real grunt work that's being done and who's pushing the party, it's not these male progressives. Were they part of it? Absolutely. And I'm not trying to diminish their contribution. However, when it came to actually pushing for a lot of these reforms, where a lot of the energy, a lot of the groundwork, where that came from, it actually came from women's clubs. The mirror image of those, the fraternal organizations I just mentioned. And there were a few. There was, in particular, you'll see on the last lecture slide and on this lecture slide. You can see it on both. You can look at the Friday Morning Club, for instance, and I'm very jealous of their building. If you go ahead and take a look at that slide, it looks lovely. But the Friday Morning Club was instrumental in pushing for a lot of progressive reforms in the LA area. And we'll talk about what those looked like a bit later on. But I wanted to note that now, that women's organizations like the Friday Morning Club, and nationally and statewide, there was a state version of this as well, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, both of these organizations were instrumental in pushing for the progressive reforms that we're going to be talking about in a bit. Now, likewise, this idea that they were generally white and came from the Midwest also deserves some scrutiny. Now, on one hand, it's absolutely correct. When we look at, who was officially a progressive and who wasn't, yeah, it was typically these old stock, these old American kind of stock types, generally from the Midwest, again, overwhelmingly white. So if we're looking at official progressives, yes, that holds true. Again, it's the issue that we just talked about with the male progressives. But due to certain factors, most notably the progressives' attitudes towards race, which are problematic at best, we'll talk about that in a minute. I feel like I've said that a lot lately, but I'm trying to keep the structure present here. But even though most progressives were, let's say, uncomfortable crossing racial lines, that didn't mean that the progressive attitude didn't cross those barriers. So just as, say, President Theodore Roosevelt was, well, frankly, uh, unjustly punishing African American soldiers for the Texas mutinies, just as President Woodrow Wilson was showing the birth of a nation and instituting segregation in the White House and kind of, insisting on a much sharper color line and federal hires. Just as that's happening, a general progressive attitude, a belief in the capability of government and the regulatory state to have a hand in fixing these issues, that was still broader. By that I mean that attitude could be found in a much wider array, a much more diverse group of people than you might expect if you just look at the official progressives. And in particular, we can look at African American political organizing in and around Los Angeles. I provided you with the image of one, Frederick M. Roberts. He's notable because he was an influential campaigner in and around Los Angeles throughout the Progressive era. He was actually our first, big air quotes here, our first known black assemblyman from in California. There are, because we did have some of the California. Let me amend that. Because there were some Californios represented in the first California Assembly, and we really don't know their own specific heritage. It's entirely possible that they have some African heritage as well. But generally, Frederick Roberts is credited as the first black assemblyman in California. And the nature of their organizing was different from progressive organizing writ large. In a lot of ways, they had to play a much more defensive nature. As progressives, how should I put this, expressed discomfort with crossing those racial barriers, men like Roberts had to deal with that. So they focused on getting particularly hostile politicians out of office. One I guess one of the better known protests was trying to force theaters to not show The Birth of a Nation. And we're going to talk about exactly what that movie was in a later lecture when we talk about early Hollywood. But the progressives were still, not the progressives, I apologize. The progressive attitude, or at least what we would call a progressive attitude today, was still certainly present amongst black Americans, even if they weren't typically welcome in the official progressive movement. So there are some problems with Maury's assessment. The final problematic assessment of Maury, again, was looking at the people who made it into office. Because yes, if you look at successful progressive politicians, many of them are Republican. But if you look at the failed races, if you look at their opponents, it's not as if it was a progressive Republican, and that phrase should sound weird to us today, right? Typically today we associate the progressives with the Democrats, and the name of progressive Republican is ridiculous. But back then, parties change over time. That's something that you have to get used to. But it wasn't as if it was just a progressive Republican running against a conservative Democrat. Oftentimes, it was a progressive Republican running against a progressive Democrat. One of these days, I'm going to remember that my screen will go dark. So I hope the video wasn't interrupted. It might have been. But anyway, it wasn't as if it was just a progressive Republican running against a conservative Democrat. It was oftentimes a progressive Democrat running against a progressive Republican. And a great example of this is in the 1910 governor's race between Hiram Johnson and Theodore Bell. Now, both of them ran on a very similar platform. The Democratic platform looked quite a bit like the Republican platform. But ultimately, what it came down to was each candidate's ties to the railroad. That was ultimately the deciding factor. Was less how progressive is the platform, and more which candidate is seen as being in the hands and kind of in the, being controlled by nationally big business, but statewide controlled by the Southern Pacific, the octopus, as Frank Norris called them. And ultimately, it was the railroad that turned that race in favor of Johnson. One of the Southern Pacific's political boosters made a contribution to Theodore Bell, thinking that Theodore Bell would be more amenable to the railroad and maybe a little bit less of a fervent progressive than Hiram Johnson, but that was really it. That was the only difference between the two. So Mowry's conclusions are a bit problematic. Not necessarily flawed. Generally speaking, his work holds up, but in a few ways it falls short. Now that said, I know we just kind of zoomed through who was a progressive, but I do want to get this done in a reasonable amount of time. So if you could open up that lecture slide number 2, or the California Progressives Part 2. I did want to introduce the lecture concepts. Again, the term list is right here. I want you to remember all of these terms. Pay special attention to them as we go through today's lecture. But I'll introduce the lecture concepts. As we just talked about, who were the progressives? What was their political background? What was their ethnic and class background? We've talked about that right now, and we talked about that in the last lecture. The next lecture concept I'd like you to be able to get a grasp of is, how did the progressives actually try to reform politics? What were their goals? What did they try and change? What did they have a problem with? Next, the progressives weren't really satisfied with just trying to reform politics. They were ambitious, if nothing else. They wanted to reform just about every aspect of American and, by extension, Californian society. So, how did they try to reform that society? Morally speaking, what direction were they trying to take the state? Now, finally, and I alluded to this a few minutes ago, but finally, what barriers did the progressives create? And they did create barriers, as we'll see. Okay, so now that that's out of the way, let me see if there's a lecture slide that we should pan to. Not really. Okay, so again, I apologize. This is kind of ad hoc. There's no high production values here. So let's see here. So when we talk about the roots of progressivism in California, and we talk about, what were the conditions that led to the rise of progressives in California. We talked about the Gilded Age difference between individualism and mutualism, between this battle between the upper class and the working class, or the leisure class and the working class. But here in California, that meant one thing, and it was a battle of the public against the railroad. And we've talked about the railroad before. Remember how they basically had, they had a finger in every pie. Maybe it's not necessarily accurate to say that they were the octopus and they controlled everything in California, but importantly, the perception of Californians at the time was that the Southern Pacific basically controlled everything, that these massive monopolies controlled everything in the state. And we talked about a few of those early scandals, like the battle at Muscle Slough, for instance, that dealt a hideous blow to their reputation, in part because it inspired Frank Norris as the octopus. But there was one other incident that I think we should mention, and that was the scandal of the Colton letters. So, so far we've been referring to the heads of the Southern Pacific as the Big Four, or the Associates. But they were also known sometimes as the Big Five, or the Big 4.5. And the fifth, or the half, depending on, your perspective, was a guy named David Colton. And Colton was their political operative operating in Sacramento and Washington, D.C. He's the one that, greased the wheels, so to speak. All those unofficial favors that the Southern Pacific relied on to keep the legislature from ever getting too hostile, he was the one doling those favors out and making those connections. Now, when he died, his widow found that her payout from that, her late husband's holdings, had been docked considerably. Now, the reasoning for that was actually pretty simple. David Colton was rumored to have embezzled quite a bit from the company. So did his widow, this might not have been great news for his widow, but the reasoning for it was that, well, he embezzled all this, so we're going to reclaim that in the payout to his widow. But she still thought that her somewhat meager payout wasn't, how should I put this, didn't reflect her husband's standing within the company. And so she took it to court. Now, in the process, importantly, all of her husband's correspondences, the letters, not just to the other members of the associates, the Big Four, but letters to congressmen, senators, important politicians, all of those became public. And this kind of plays into a repeating, a problem for the Southern Pacific. They oftentimes, when they get embroiled in these political battles, oftentimes they win, and oftentimes they're in the right. Like in the case of the Colton letters, they ended up winning this court case because they could demonstrate that, yes, David Colton did things that, he unofficially drew this money out of the company. So yeah, he's like his holding within the company is reduced. It's that simple. Or in the Battle of Muscle Slough, just like in the Battle of Muscle Slough, the settlers were really the ones at fault. They weren't the downtrodden members of society that they played themselves up to be. And the Southern Pacific won there as well. But in both cases, even though they won the battle, you've heard the phrase, this is the battle, not the war, or, you can win the battle and lose the war, and derivatives of that. That's definitely the case here. Because just as much as they were winning these fights, it dealt them hideous blows in the public arena and in the public's eye. Like in Muscle Slough, of course, this led to Frank Norris's The Octopus, which dealt them a boatload of negative PR. And in the case of the Colton letters, if they had just paid out Colton's widow, they would have avoided this embarrassing public scandal where ordinary working people got a deep, ugly look at just how far the Southern Pacific's influence went. And of course, in the courts and in the newspapers, it looked as if the Southern Pacific was... Who are they fighting? They're fighting a poor widow, right? They're trying to take money out of the hands of a former friend's widow, of all things. And that just looks hideous. No matter how justified it is, it looks absolutely awful. So when we're talking about progressive ideas in California, and when we're talking about the reforms that progressives want to make in California, most of them are tied to regulating big business and trying to reform politics, because many progressives thought that it was fundamentally a corruption of politics that was leading to all of this. And they had a few ideas of how they were specifically going to fix this issue. They had a number of electoral reforms which were very important even today. You're going to be familiar with them. The first is, of course, let me bring this up actually. I want to make sure that I'm proceeding through these in a well-ordered manner. So the first of these was the initiative/referendum addition to California law. Most of you are familiar with initiatives. because most of you are familiar with propositions, and this is the method by which a potential law can be added to the ballot without interference from the state legislature. There was a heavy amount, there was a lot of distrust of government that the progressives had, especially of establishment politics. They thought that, and not incorrectly, that many politicians in California were tied to the Southern Pacific. So they wanted the option to make an end run around all of those corrupt politicians and be able to add laws directly to the books without politicians being able to interfere. And this is, of course, terrifically influential today with, most big sweeping changes in California politics have been made via this proposition system. I think the most relevant recent one, and this isn't going to be terribly relevant in Kern County, because they left local options in, was the legalization of marijuana. That was accomplished, this end run, skirting the edges of the legislation just to try and accomplish it without any of this interference. Prior to that, even though it was struck down, was Prop 8. That is the banning of gay marriage within California. Again, that was later struck down. Prior to that, right now, the big initiative battle lining up for November is the Schools and Communities First initiative, which is trying to undo some of what Prop 13 did back in the day, which capped certain real estate taxes, certain property taxes. So it's not as if the proposition system is necessarily, how should I put this? It's not unilaterally left-wing or right-wing, but what it has allowed is for this direct line to politics. It enables direct democracy, for good or ill. Another terrifically influential, this might not be relevant for many of you, but for at least a few of you, you should remember the recall of Governor Gray Davis. And the recall is, again, another progressive reform into California politics. The recall being that, Californians can call for a recall. That is the removal of an elected official from office and their replacement. That's how we ended up with Governor Schwarzenegger, the governator, right? Was because of Gray Davis' removal from office. And again, another end run around political machines and establishment politics was the enactment, calling for and instituting direct elections and primaries here in the state. So prior to, this might not be familiar to most of you, but prior to this, typically senators were chosen by the state's legislature. It was in no way, shape, or form related to an election of any kind. But because progressives were so uneasy with, kind of the wheeling and dealing in the backroom politics of the day, they thought that, if the people could directly elect their own senators, that those senators would be more responsive. And that was true. Again, though, whether, the impact that had on right or left-wing politics, that's kind of a moot point. But they did directly empower voting citizens. Finally, not finally, the big one is actually following this one. They also instituted primaries, which is what California has today, if you've been paying attention. Primaries, the system by which nominees of political parties are chosen. Prior to the enactment of primaries and caucuses, most of the time political nominations would be made in, kind of these, your standard Gilded Age idea of what politics looks like. It's a bunch of, dudes wearing tweed suits, sitting in a back room over a card game, smoking cigars, drinking whiskey. and that's where, you know, who exactly the nominee is going to be. That's where these deals were hammered out. And progressives wanted to strike a blow at that sort of backroom um, establishment politics, and they certainly did. Um, that's, you know, yeah. Um, Now the big one isn't necessarily a progressive reform. The big reform in California politics, as far as electoral reform was concerned, was women's suffrage. And suffrage, you know, sometimes people are unfamiliar with this term, and it's fine. It hasn't been in vogue for quite some time. Suffrage, S-U-F-F-R-A-G-E, is the right to vote. And I say that it wasn't necessarily a progressive idea because progressives in California and progressives nationwide were pretty lukewarm on the idea. Every time that this comes up, just like in the California Constitution of 1879, you know, there were calls to make, you know, to grant women suffrage then as well. And that of course didn't pan out. Most of those who participated in the Constitutional Convention kind of laughed off those claims. And here it was less of a progressive issue because progressives were marginally more in favor of it, but women's suffrage, the support for it kind of came from all parties. You can actually see if you scroll over here. Where did those images go? Here we are. You will see 3 posters. Vote yes, send amendment number 8, October 10th, 1911. Justice for California women. And it was these same women's clubs. It was the Women's Christian Temperance Union. It was the Friday Morning Club. It was organizations like that, headed by like Caroline Marie Seymour Severance. I think there's actually an image of her. Where did she go? Okay, image or not, she's included in the readings that you just did. And ultimately, in 1911, this amendment in California politics was actually passed. Again, though, with lukewarm support from progressives. Now, all of this, their political reforms, you know, like I said, progressives were uneasy with the working class. As much as they wanted to improve their lives, they also wanted to change them. And sometimes in paternalistic ways. So just as much as they wanted their citizens, just as much as they wanted every citizen to have the right to vote, and they wanted every citizen to be able to participate more fully in politics, they also wanted to make sure that those citizens were a little bit better educated. So just like, again, we can look to the women's clubs for this. Just as the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the Friday Morning Club was pushing for the right to vote, they were also pushing for the kindergarten movement. Without the kindergarten movement, you know, this adoption from Germany of early childhood education for everyone, without these women's clubs pushing for it, we never would have seen that here in the States. And that was part of their idea here. You know, as much as they're giving working class people and direct democracy more sway and more power in the United States, they want those citizens to be able to better execute and better exercise those rights at the same time. Just as, you know, and it wasn't just limited to childhood education as well. The progressive era in California is also where we see the rise of junior colleges. And in fact, that's where Bakersfield College came from. You can actually see, I found when I was looking through the archives just here at BC, if you look up, you'll see a picture of just an old typed up page with some text scrolled at the bottom. And this is the original course offerings that you could sign up for at what became Bakersfield College. I do think it's a little bit funny that history was clearly an add-on because, you know, everything else is nice and typed up, but history is just kind of, you know, scrawled in the margins. Elegant handwriting, but clearly a later edition. So yeah, so just as the progressives are trying to reform politics, they're also trying to reform society. Now, they didn't just stop at education, however. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of the progressives were not just Protestant, not just evangelical, they were profoundly Protestant. They came from very religious, very evangelical backgrounds. And they had some ideas, again, like as we talked about in the last lecture, they came from kind of a Victorian background a lot of the time. And because of that, they cared deeply about the home. And not just the home as some sentiment, not just the home as a physical place where you live, a property that you own, but the home as kind of a sanctuary from life at the time, especially for the menfolk who have to deal with what life is like out in the big urban industrializing city. They need a sanctuary to come home to. And as much as they wanted to, most of their moral reforms came out of this deep seated desire to protect the home and family life. And for progressives, there was a holy trinity of issues that they thought they needed to tackle. One was divorce. This was their overriding concern. They want to protect marriage because marriage and the home are inseparable. A married family, a home can be an apartment. That's totally fine in the progressive worldview of the day. Much just as they wanted to protect the home and the family, right along with that is trying to limit the quantity of alcohol consumed, and oftentimes trying to bar it altogether. The roots of prohibition are certainly found in the progressive movement, because they looked at what's the number one factor for most relationships and marriages failing. They look at it and they say, okay, well clearly it's alcohol, so we need to try and limit alcohol's destructive influence on society. And finally, the last of the holy trinity of sins to tackle was prostitution. Prostitution, again, all of these issues were interwoven for progressives. You can't really tackle one without tackling the other, but all of them constituted an attack on American homes, American families, and ultimately the destruction of American society itself. So they tackled these in a few ways. Most prominently, because they hoped to solve the first one, divorce, by attacking alcohol consumption and attacking prostitution. Let me scroll through here. To try and combat the consumption of alcohol, they passed the local option law, and that was geared to allow and empower individual counties to become dry. Did that work? Well, not necessarily. It ultimately made it such that it meant that. Oh, pardon me. Yes, well, individual counties could opt into becoming dry counties where, you can't purchase liquor, where saloons are illegal. Ultimately, it even came down to, what locality you were in, going deeper than the county level. Because if the local police department doesn't want to prosecute the saloon owner that they know, those laws are ultimately irrelevant. And they tried to combat prostitution by passing, the Red Light Abatement Act, and that allowed brothels, which at the time were basically, kind of masqueraded as hotels with long-term residents. It allowed those to just be padlocked up and closed. But this penchant for probity, this penchant for moral rectitude, as they would call it, wasn't just limited to larger issues like alcoholism and prostitution. In some cases, we've got kind of a tale of two cities, like we talked about in the last lecture. This between San Francisco and Los Angeles. San Francisco was incredibly metropolitan. San Francisco, you've got quite a bit of international trade. It's the western hub for that in the United States, and it has a reputation as a city of sin. it kind of has the reputation that Las Vegas has today. San Francisco definitely had that, especially Barbary Coast and the Tenderloin. And trust me, the Tenderloin is still incredibly sketchy today. I had one nightmarish experience that I can't share here. So just as San Francisco is kind of embracing sin, and we see the issues with passing these statewide laws to limit prostitution and to limit alcohol consumption, San Francisco is flaunting that. From about 1908 to I think it's 1911, the mayor of San Francisco would have a yearly parade through these red light districts, through the Barbary Coast, with the owner of one of the most prominent brothels in the city. And it was a pleasure parade, right? It was celebrating San Francisco's reputation as a wild city, a city of sin. So clearly it's difficult to regulate human behavior if the mayor of all people is participating in these parades, right? Now, at the same time, Los Angeles it's embracing this kind of puritanical attitude. And in part, that's because, well, Los Angeles at the time, the population of Los Angeles had been increased dramatically because of the migration of Midwesterners to the region. A lot of those old stock Americans that Maury was talking about made up the population of, especially the new politically influential population of Los Angeles. So in Los Angeles, they were far more successful at punishing saloon owners, punishing brothel owners, but they went a bit farther than quite a bit farther than that. If you're familiar at all with the movie Footloose, you might know where I'm going with this, because I'm not kidding here, even dancing was targeted by progressive reformers. And here's some of the laws that were enacted in Los Angeles, of all places. Think about laws like this being found in Los Angeles today as I go through this list, all right? It's nutty. So, for instance, no dancing with the cheek or head touching the dance partner. The male could only place his hand on the partner's back between shoulder and waist. The female partner could only place her hand in her partner's left hand, and I quote, music suggestive of bodily contortions, end quote, could be played. Now, of course, by that they're talking about jazz, as jazz is picking up in popularity throughout the United States and in California. Progressive reformers they're worried, and they're not just worried about sin, they're worried about to be frank, they're worried about interracial relationships. They worried that nightclubs, that bars, that all of the vice elements of society, they had their own fears, but partnered with their more general fears was the threat of race suicide. The idea that this is a long outdated idea. It's basically what happens when people take Darwin's theory of evolution and apply it to humans, which doesn't really work. But they were worried that the white race, and again, big air quotes around that, white race, because that's kind of a useless concept to talk to any anthropologist today, and they'll tell you how, was going to disappear because of intermarriage and interracial relationships. And they thought that these nightclubs, in particular, were places where white women would be corrupted or become involved with black or Asian men. And this segues us perfectly into that last conceptual question that I brought up, and that is, what barriers did the progressives create? And they certainly created barriers. Now, the one thing that I have to say, the big caveat to all of this, is that it's a bit more difficult to understand than we might think, because today, when we think of segregation, today when we think of today when we think of anyone that today we would just call them white supremacists, but the nuance takes us, the context leads us to a slightly different understanding. Not a positive understanding, but in context, it's a little bit different. The best way that I can understand it, the best way that I have heard it described, again, we have to hark back to Michael McGirr's work, A Fierce Discontent. I like the way he puts it. When he refers to the progressives' thought, like attitudes regarding race, as the shield of segregation. So what do they mean by that? Well, for instance, let me flip open to one of these. Lovely sources. Here we go. I just want to have that ready. So it wasn't necessarily that most progressives thought that certain races were inferior to others, or certain were superior to others. On some level, that was certainly true. But most scholars would agree that I'm safe in saying that most scholars would agree that they thought that most races were better off apart and not intermingling. That is, most progressives thought that the races would be better off living in their own enclaves. And that was certainly reflected in the American South at the time, as segregation was, taking root in a much more, instead of just being the, de facto way of life, but instead being codified into law. That happened during the Progressive era. And in some cases it was, the white people calling for it. Those people thought that this was for the betterment of everyone, because this was also during the height of, the peak of lynching in the United States. So some reformers did sincerely believe that if we could just separate these two populations, that the lynching would stop, right? These horrific public extra legal executions, we could put a stop to those if we just separate the races. Now, many progressives did also buy into scientific racism and did believe that certain races were inferior to others. There was a broad array of thought within progressivism, but most progressives were uncomfortably comfortable with segregation as not just a fact, but as an ideal. Now, elsewhere in the United States, that was typically applied to African Americans when we talk about segregation. But here in California, in part because the black population was much lower at the time, here in California, that nasty little instinct, it took a different turn, and instead was directed at the population that replaced the Chinese in the wake of the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1887. And that would be the Japanese. Japanese immigrants started coming to California soon after the Chinese were displaced. And here we have to turn to a little bit of context. I know you're probably tired of hearing that word. But you got to understand, so this immigration spiked in the 1890s, and Californians, they returned to that rhetoric of another perceived invasion coming down the pipeline. Now, most of these early Japanese immigrants, they found themselves working in the agricultural sector, especially like the orange groves of Southern California. Unlike the Chinese, however, unlike those Chinese immigrants, Japanese immigrants were better able to leverage their own collective labor to ensure higher wages, better working conditions. In short, they were more successful at organizing. I'm not going to say they tried harder or any nonsense like that, but they were, as a fact, they were more successful at collective bargaining. And this made them a threat to white Californians. And here's where we have to get into that context. You see, up until about 1853, Japan was an isolationist power. They weren't particularly interested in what the outside world was doing, um, and they weren't particularly interested in modernizing or industrializing. However, that issue was forced in 1853 when Commodore Perry of the U.S. Navy forced the opening of Japan. He brought a bunch of warships into Tokyo Bay and demanded that the country open itself up to foreign trade and foreign influence. Now, this was, somewhat traumatic for their national psyche, for Japan's national psyche, and many political and military leaders realized what the end result of that isolationism was going to be, and it meant that Japan was going to end up as a colonized power unless they changed course quickly. So they ushered in a blistering pace of reforms, and this was broadly known as the Meiji Restoration, began in the 1860s onward. So they adopted not just they brought in experts from all over the world, mostly from Western powers. From the big players of the day. They brought in military leaders, mostly from the Western world, to reform their military. They brought in business leaders to reform their economy and to try and turn it into more of an industrial instead of an agricultural system. And for the most part, as this was going on, Western powers ignored them. Through some, either through condescension or contempt, they just didn't think that it was going to be that big of a deal. And that changed in the Russo-Japanese War in 1904, lasted until 1905. And I know we've skipped a lot of slides. I apologize for that. I'm a little bit all over the place. You can see a few of these slides. There's 4 of them. It's right after this. It's page 13 in the PDF. You can see how Western powers, in these images, you can see how Western powers thought this conflict was going to play out. Here's a Russian postcard, and you can see the Russian military roundly trouncing this Japanese military figure, kicking him back to Japan. In the following one, you can see, and this one has a little bit more of a, racialized caricature to it. You can see this, strapping young Russian warship. When you're looking at it, you'll understand it. Kind of a Russian Popeye, really. Beating the crap out of this Japanese warship, and the Japanese warship, the figure, the masthead that's come to life, is portrayed in a pretty ugly caricature portrayal of a Japanese man. And so this was the expectation of what this conflict was going to look like. And instead, here are some Japanese postcards. Instead, the Japanese roundly defeated the Russians, and this was a horrendous blow to the collective psyche of white and Western powers that were active in the world, because all of a sudden they realized that this country, to their eyes, that was made up of brown people, who shouldn't be able to go toe to toe with these white Western powers. All of a sudden, that country had just gotten trounced. And not just any country, by the way. This is Russia. This is an old imperial power, well established for centuries upon centuries upon centuries. So for this tiny upstart nation to deal a crippling blow to one of the oldest imperial powers in Europe was the worst kind of wake-up call if you were one of these white Western powers. Now, depending on who you were talking to, that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. In fact, Theodore Roosevelt tended to admire Japan. He looked at Japan as the counterpart of the United States for Asia. So just as the United States is going to be this, progressive, modernizing influence on the Western world, kind of leading the world for democracy at the time, Japan would lead Asia out of being, kind of a colonial backwater, would lead them into modernization and progress and, a wonderful new era. He still wanted them to stay on the other side of the ocean, but he admired them all the same. Now, the relationship between these two powers was, well, it was oftentimes pretty complicated. So, for instance, in the 1906 earthquake and firestorm, the nations were close enough that Japan sent $250,000 of aid to San Francisco to try and, alleviate the suffering. However, in part because of fears aggravated by the earthquake, and I'm not blaming the Japanese residents of San Francisco at all for this, but as general tensions like class and ethnic tensions were stoked by this disaster, this actually led to the San Francisco Board of Education trying to order Japanese students to attend a separate school, an Oriental public school. And that was deeply insulting. Not just, and this is where things get kind of complicated, because the Japanese students didn't want to be lumped in with Chinese students. So there's some complicated racial issues to unpack there. But they felt deeply insulted by the fact that, as they're modernizing and demonstrating that they're a modern Western power, that they are, of the same caliber as the United States. Maybe not, the same magnitude, but the same sort of quality. At the same time, their students are being treated like, well, as second-class citizens. And let me, if you will forgive me, I do need to break out the book, so to speak, because there are a few let's see here. There are a few revealing quotes regarding how San Franciscans and Californians, how they perceived these Japanese residents. Now let me fix the curtains real quick just to get a little bit of extra light in here. So, let's see here. Now, here's, if you'll forgive me, I'm going to read a brief passage that I think sums up how, well, it's illustrative of how many Californians thought of the Japanese. Okay, so here's part of a speech made in the House of Representatives on March 13th, 1906 by a California member, one E.A. Hayes. Again, this is a large block quote. A close acquaintance shows one that unblushing lying is so universal among the Japanese as to be one of the leading national traits, that commercial honor, even among her commercial classes, is so rare as to be only the exception that proves the reverse rule, and that the vast majority of Japanese people do not understand the meaning of the word morality, but are given up to practice of licentiousness meaning lewd behavior with women. So not just implications of premarital sex, but also of kind of insinuating rape and unwelcome sexual contact. More generally than any nation in the world, justly making any pretenses to civilization. I am told by those who have lived in Japan and understand its language that there is no word in Japanese corresponding to sin, because there is in the ordinary Japanese mind no conception of its meaning. There is no word corresponding to the word home, because there is nothing in Japanese domestic life corresponding to the home as we know it. The Japanese language has no term for privacy. They lacked the term and the clear idea because they lack the practice. And again, this is all one large block quote. But there's a lot to unpack there. I mean, not only do we see that reference to the progressive and Victorian ideal of the home, but that's some pretty heated material to throw out, to be perfectly frank. And if you'll forgive me, I'm going to read a few other passages that illustrate just how much the Japanese people were othered by Californians at the time. So let's see, my next good example, 114. Okay. Hold on just a moment. So, we'll jump back to that in just a moment. I mixed up my directions. So this, the San Francisco Board of Education tried to bar Japanese students from the public schools at the time. They wanted to send them to a separate one, by and large because they were concerned that these Japanese students were going to behave inappropriately with young white women. Now, where this issue came from is kind of complicated to say. So here we have Secretary Metcalf, who was reporting on, just was this a widespread phenomenon? Did most people care about this? Many of the foremost educators in the state, on the other hand, are strongly opposed to the action of the San Francisco Board of Education. Japanese are admitted to the University of California, an institution maintained and supported by the state. They are also admitted to and gladly welcomed at Stanford University. San Francisco, so far as known, is the only city which has discriminated against Japanese children. I talked with a number of prominent labor men, and they all said they had no objection to Japanese children attending the primary grades, that they wanted the Japanese children now in the United States to have the same school privileges as children of other nations. And we really see, the California view towards the Japanese was horrifically unpopular on a national level. But here in California, if California was its own republic, if California was its own nation, it would have passed some horrifically anti-Japanese laws, and one does squeak by. We'll talk about that in a minute. But because it was so unpopular nationwide, that kind of placed a limit on the extent of the laws that they could pass. Now again, Roosevelt admired Japan, and in part because of that admiration, and in part because California and San Francisco trying to discriminate against Japanese students this way made the United States look like, made them look like fools on the national stage. It was a hideous embarrassment. He was openly enraged by the actions of the San Francisco Board of Education. So much so that he ordered Mayor Schmitz to the Capitol to try and figure out a way to, get the San Francisco Board of Education to back down. Now, ultimately, he couldn't quite do it without working out a deal with Japan. And this is it was kind of a backroom deal. It was an unofficial deal, and it was called the Gentleman's Agreement. And it was hammered out over 1907 and 1908. And it was a guarantee to the Japanese government that the United States would protect not just Japanese American citizens, but Japanese residents, that they wouldn't be discriminated against in public life. But in return, Japan would severely curtail immigration to the United States. So there was a bit of give and take on both sides there. Not a particularly good look for the United States at the time, especially because those California progressives, not a few years later, careened down the same path. You can see a few images. If we skip down to vote yes on Proposition number 1, Alien Land Law, save California from the, this is a slur today, save California from the Japs. this was another attempt to, despite Roosevelt's promises, to discriminate against Japanese residents of California. So let's see here. Let's go ahead and skip to page 132. I think that has the best example of it. Oh, right. So here's a passage from this law that, he's trying to explain how clearly it's not designed to discriminate, regardless of the fact that the one group this targets are Asian immigrants to the United States. So, okay, so this is, here we go. By the law adopted, we offer no offense, we make no discrimination. The offense and discrimination are contained, it is claimed, in the use of the words eligible to citizenship. We do not mention the Japanese or any other race. If invidious discriminations ever were made in this regard, the United States made them when the United States declared who were and who were not eligible for citizenship. If discrimination, it is discrimination against California. We insist that justly no offense can be taken by any nation to this law. We of California have violated absolutely no treaty rights. We have shown no shadow of discrimination. We have given no nation the right to be justified in taking offense. Now, maybe I've gotten a bit ahead of myself, but of course, the point of this law, the Alien Land Law, prevented those who were ineligible for citizenship. It prevented them from purchasing land. So that upward mobility that, most immigrants to the United States rely on, if you are working in the agricultural sector, you're working as a farmhand, you're working as harvest labor, you save up your money and eventually you buy your own farm. That was all of a sudden now barred to Japanese residents in California. Kind of. Actually, much like the Japanese earlier, collective bargaining being a successful method of trying to restrain the worst impulses of Californians towards Japanese, they pretty quickly found some workarounds to the uses of trusts. But in the end, the intent of Californians was the same. In point of fact, this contributes to what Kerry McWilliams calls the California-Japanese War. And we'll revisit this in the future, especially when we start talking about, the lead up. Recording lectures takes a little bit more out of me than giving them in person, especially when we start talking about the behavior of the nation and California towards Japanese Americans during World War II. So we're going to call it there. Feel free to peruse some of the other images in the lecture slide. I'm sorry that we didn't get to them. I'll try and be more, organized in the future, but, I'm still adjusting to this. So you will see lectures on time this upcoming Tuesday. So thank you for bearing with me. If you have any questions, please send me an email. Thanks.